The FMC's request for information on a potential emergency order is still open. Have you filed your comments yet? Let's talk through what's being asked and some of the comments that have actually already been filed. Hi, welcome to By Land and By Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Beagen, founder of the Maritime Professor and Squall Strategies, and I'm your favorite maritime attorney. Join me every week as we walk through both ocean transport and surface transport topics in the wild world of supply chain. As always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice, and there is no attorney-client privilege created by this video. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So before we get into the discussion of the day, let's go through my top 3 stories of the week. So story number 1. We're on the verge of a major shipping slowdown. How many times a year, a week, a month do we have to hear that? But this time, we are again. The future is the past here, and rail holds the key. There's a very real possibility that there will be a rail strike next week by unions representing 90,000 workers nationwide. This strike is set to start September 16th after a cool-down period set by President Biden 60 days ago. That expires September 16th, and it's being reported by CNN. CNN has this now. This is big if CNN has this. Supply chain back in the mainstream media. CNN is reporting that 40% of the nation's freight could be halted due to the strike. Yes, we do have over-the-road truckers, as we all know, but a significant portion of freight is also moved by rail. And we're about to find out just how significant that portion of rail is if this strike happens. The unions negotiate with the National Railway Labor Conference, and reportedly a meeting with federal mediators and U.S. Secretary of Labor Marty Walsh. Apparently that meeting made no progress. CNN's also reporting that the key issue here, the key thing that's being negotiated, isn't pay necessarily, but it's on-call requirements for workers, specifically engineers and conductors. They are required to be on call 7 days a week. Essentially, they don't get a day off, right, if they're on call all the time. I'm going to keep watching this. This is really interesting and very significant, and it's heating up very quickly, and I just feel like I'm not seeing enough coverage of it. I guess there's coverage, but hey, this is a big deal. The the Association of American Railroads, is estimating that a nationwide strike could actually cost $2 billion each day. FreightWaves reported that the association said that. This is interesting. But you know what? Story number 2. Speaking of labor union negotiations, not great new news for the International Longshore Warehouse Union and the Pacific Maritime Association. So last week, Paul Berger of the Wall Street Journal reported that the International Longshore Warehouse Union, the ILWU, refused to work the automated section of the Port of Los Angeles. At the time, when Paul reported that, I posted it on LinkedIn, and I mentioned that it felt like a shift in the negotiation environment. For a very long time, the ILWU said strikes were not on the table. They were not going to be slowing down any sort of progress with movement of containers of goods. But refusal to work, it's hard to argue that that's not a slowdown of goods. Refusing to work the automated section, I get they were making a point. I get that. I understand that. But it just feels like it's a shift in the negotiation environment. And now labor strikes being tossed around in discussion. The security guard labor union might be going on strike soon. This is all, Peter Tershwell appropriately said, this is worrisome. This is now worrisome. Peter of JOC, this isn't a good shift, guys. This is not a good shift. I don't like where this is moving. Without this labor negotiation in place, the more strain on the actual relationship, the worse everything gets. Because if they don't have a contract to go back to kind of guide the discussion, and really these are open, hot button issues that haven't been closed yet because the negotiation hasn't closed out. Well, this isn't the first time we've been here, though. This is not the first time that there has been contention between the ILWU and the Pacific Maritime Association. This is not the first time by any means that we've gone beyond contract negotiation expiration and that we've had this contract negotiation continue on. I did a podcast on this. I think that you should go take a look at it. The history of the ILWU and the Pacific Maritime Association, go check it out on By Land and By Sea podcast on demand. It was a couple months ago. We cover a lot of really interesting information on what the relationship has looked like. This isn't even the most contentious it's ever been. We one time went out through December, January, February. So this is not the longest nor the most contentious, but it doesn't make it any easier in the moment, does it? I don't know. It's a worrisome new trend. Peter got it right. Story number 3, non-union related. We're still on rulemaking watch. We're still watching the FMC. The FMC is set to release 3 different rulemakings that they were required to under OSRA. They were required to initiate these rulemakings on a 30, 45, and 60-day timeline. I had initially thought that initiate the rulemaking meant release the text. The FMC chairman, Dan Maffei, has said at the recent FMC commission meeting hearing, which was at the end of July, he said he saw initiate as begin work within the commission. That's fine. A lot of these have a 6-month or 1-year expiration or conclusion requirement. So if they weren't going to release the text on the 30, 45, or 60 days, they are bound to finalizing the full rule by the end of this. The 30-day requirement, the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations, does have a 60-day or six-month requirement to conclude the rulemaking. So here we are, it's already September. That puts us at mid-December that this is supposed to be concluded, and we still haven't seen any language out of this first rulemaking, unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations. That was required to be initiated on 30 days. So OSRA was signed June 16th. So mid-July was when this was required to be initiated. The FMC chairman assured that it was initiated on that timeline, but he had said at the time that he expects immediate or very soon the language to come out. We still haven't seen it. I'm still hopeful that we're going to see it. I still think that I keep saying I think it's going to come in a week or 2. I just don't know. I'm guessing. But now here we are, just over a month after the Commission FMC chairman said that we're going to see this soon. We haven't seen it yet. So we're still on rulemaking watch. The other 2 rules are the detention and demurrage prohibited practices. That was 45 days from mid-June. So really that should have been early August initiated. And then we have the unfair, unjust, discriminatory methods, which was 60 days from June 16th was required to be initiated. So, that would have been mid-August. They have a lot going on, but there's no movement yet. But I did want to jump into another OSRA-related thing. So let's get into the meat and the potatoes of the day. So here is a huge elephant in the room. And we need to, it's not a huge element in the room. Here, the FMC wants to know. They want to know, do we need an emergency order here? Do we need to do something on a quick turnaround with a quick timeline due to an emergency? Emergency can have a long timeline, but it needs to be something that is happening right now. So this is docket number 2219, and we still only have 16 comments. So what is this emergency order all about? Look, it all goes back to OSRA, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022 that was passed June 16th. Doesn't everything FMC related go back to OSRA 22 these days? So the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022 had a very long to-do list for the FMC. We covered it on the top 3 stories of the week, and now here we are covering it in the meat and potatoes of the day. Let's recount. OSRA 22 was passed using the Senate version. There was a House version and a Senate version, using the Senate version, and then was signed by the President on June 16, 2022. One of the sections of OSRA, Section 18, required that not later than 60 days after the effective date of the act, the Commission must issue a request for information. So again, when I was talking about the other 3 rules, I took initiate to be issue. This actually does say the Commission must issue a request for information within 60 days, seeking public comment regarding specific criteria, namely, 1, whether congestion of the... So this is what the OSRA told the FMC they must release a request for information on these topics. So these 3 topics. So starting with number 1, whether congestion of the carriage of goods has created an emergency situation of a magnitude such that there exists a substantial adverse effect on the competitiveness and reliability of the international ocean transportation supply system. Don't worry, we're going to break these down like we always do. Number 2, whether an emergency order under Section 18 would alleviate such an emergency situation. And number 3, the appropriate scope of such an emergency order, if applicable. So, look, simply stated, the Federal Maritime Commission is seeking comments on the benefits of issuing an emergency order requiring information sharing. The benefits of issuing an emergency order, the FMC issuing it, which would require information sharing. The comment period is only open for 30 days. It started August 15th, which is when the Federal Register notice was published, and we've talked about that before. The Federal Register is essentially the classified ads of, how there's a classified ads in the newspaper where you get a lot of information, town meetings, public announcements. The Federal Register is kind of that for the federal government. So all federal agencies post their notices in the Federal Register. So it was published August 15th in the Federal Register. So now the comments are due September 14th. That's 30 days later. So here's the language from the FMC on it. The Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022, OSRA, enacted as Public Law 117146, authorizes the FMC to issue such an emergency order after seeking comments from the trade on 3 questions. So these are the 3 questions restated. First, has congestion created an emergency situation of a magnitude such that there exists a substantial adverse effect on the competitiveness and reliability of the international ocean transportation supply system? 2, second, would an emergency order issued by the Commission alleviate the emergency situation? And third, what would be the appropriate scope of the emergency order? The FMC is urging commenters to limit their observations to the need and benefits of the emergency order. I mean, they're basically saying just stay on task here. Like, there's a lot going wrong, but let's just talk about the need and the benefits of this emergency order. So OSRA also stated that during this process, the Commission can actually consult, as it deems appropriate, other federal departments and agencies and persons with expertise relating to maritime and freight operations. So they can ask others around. They can, they're doing this request for information, but they're not limited to that. They can ask around. So the notice fulfills this OSRA 22 requirement. I wonder if this contemplated, I've asked this before, but I wonder if this contemplated the FMC working with DOT on the flow initiative. I don't know. It feels like there's a million different initiatives out there on supply chain movement. DOT is working on one called the Flow Initiative. I hope the FMC is working with them on that. So what does all this mean? The FMC gave a little background on what predicated this emergency order idea, and there's some nuggets of information in their summary of what happened. So the FMC paints the picture of COVID and related congestion and describes it as, and I quote, spending on services decreased significantly while consumer spending on goods increased considerably, leading to a renewed and increased demand for ocean transportation services. So they're saying consumers were driving this. Carriers responded with increases in vessel capacity. However, this rapid shift in cargo volumes driven by consumer demand led to bottlenecks throughout the United States supply chain system. In particular, increased container dwell times at marine terminals led to inefficiencies, including delays in vessel berthing and motor carrier services at U.S. ports. So that's what the FMC is saying. There's always a little controversy on why congestion happened, and we're not here today to talk about why it happened. But the FMC is simply stating that it was due to an increase in demand that led to bottlenecking. But that's not what the emergency order is about. So with this background, the FMC more clearly states there are 3 questions here. Whether congestion of the carriage of goods has created an emergency situation, but not just an emergency situation, of a magnitude such that there exists a substantial adverse effect on the competitiveness and reliability of the international ocean transportation supply system. If so, please explain why and provide examples or data to support your view. They want you to provide examples. They want to understand how this works for you more specifically. If not, please explain why and provide examples or data to support your view. In other words, they're asking whether congestion is so bad that it's created an emergency situation, and that emergency situation is so bad that there's harmful effects on competitiveness and reliability of the international ocean transportation supply system. I mean, the answer is yes, right? There's an emergency situation that's so bad that there's harmful effects on the competitiveness and reliability of the International Ocean Transportation Supply System, the competitiveness and reliability of the movement of cargo boxes out there. So the second question, so if that's a yes, would an emergency order pursuant to Section 18, so would this emergency order alleviate or improve such an emergency situation? And if so, why? And if not, why not? So in other words, would an emergency order help here? They want to know, like, there is an emergency out there. There's this emergency situation that's so bad that it's affecting competitiveness and reliability of the movement, of the ability to move boxes around. Would an emergency order help here? And then the third question, appropriately so, the appropriate scope, duration, and geographic. They want you to scope it to the duration of the emergency order and the geographic scope of the emergency order of such an emergency, if the commission were to issue such an order, and the basis for that scope. So in other words, what scope, like I said, duration or geographic, it would need to be targeted, tailored to the problem that is, in part, creating this emergency. So the commission's already putting out what they think the emergency order might look like, at least as a start. So they said, if the commission issues an emergency order, common carriers and MTOs, terminals, would be required to share directly with relevant shippers, rail carriers, or motor carriers information relating to cargo throughput and availability. So the cargo throughput and the availability of cargo. An emergency order will remain in effect for not longer than 60 days, but the commission could renew the order. So like I said, this is based on an emergency. And they're saying that since there's an emergency that exists, we need to fix that emergency. And would this help? Maybe it won't solve it, but would this help the emergency? The commission could actually renew the order. So the initial order would be not longer than 60 days, but the commission could actually renew that order. So issuing both an emergency order and a renewal of an emergency requires a unanimous vote by the commission. So the commission's authority to issue emergency orders terminates 18 months after the June 16, 2022 enactment of OSRA. So that's 18 months, a year and a half from June 16th. So we'd be looking at December 2023. So like I said, the emergency order, in order to go into effect, has to be unanimous by the commission for the emergency order and for the renewal. I mean, it seems like if you have the first emergency order, you're probably going to have the renewal if 60 days is pretty quick, but I don't know. So what does that look like? What information is cargo throughput and availability? Look, there's some general things, date containers made available, but like what we saw recently in the D&D invoice billing requirements. But let's go back to the OSRA text to see what they thought on what would be cargo throughput. So OSRA Section 18 says, the commission may issue an emergency order requiring any common carrier or marine terminal operator to share directly with relevant shippers, rail carriers, and motor carriers information relating to cargo throughput and availability in order to ensure the efficient transportation, loading, and unloading of cargo to or from any inland destination or point of origin, any vessel, or any point on a wharf or terminal. So this broadens it a bit, right? They're saying not just loading or unloading of the cargo on and off the vessel, but they're also saying any inland destination or point of origin and any point on a wharf or terminal. So more than just when that cargo gets offloaded the ship. They want this information to be provided by the common carriers or marine terminal operators to share directly with shippers, rail carriers, or motor carriers. If you could benefit from the information of loading and unloading of cargo to or from any inland destination or point of origin, any vessel, or any point on a wharf or terminal, if you could benefit from getting that information, and if it's not being provided to you now, this is your moment to file these comments that they're asking, would this help you? And they want you to say, yes, it would, and here's why. So Section 18 of OSRA also says the commission shall tailor the emergency order with respect to temporal, so time-based, and geographic scope, taking into consideration the likely burdens on common carriers and marine terminal operators and the likely benefits on congestion. So they're saying, look, we don't just want to benefit the shippers. We don't only want to be benefiting the rail carriers or the motor carriers here, because we know that this is going to be tough on common carriers and marine terminal operators. They might not have this is going to be a burden. So they want to lessen those burdens by tailoring the emergency order. But look, if it's an emergency and it's really having a emergency impact, it's so bad that there's this emergency impact, look, it's going to be a little uncomfortable. It might be a little burdensome. But Section 18 is just basically saying, of OSRA, basically saying that they just need to tailor it. They can't just make it so that it's so burdensome. They have to tailor it so that they make it tenable, they make it operationally available and possible for the common carriers and the MTOs to actually, satisfy the emergency order, whatever the order is. So what if this causes undue hardship or other condition rendering compliance with such a requirement impracticable? So that's kind of building off of that narrowly tailored, or they don't even say narrow, they tailoring the emergency order to reduce the burden on the common carriers. But what if it doesn't actually reduce the burden? What if it's such a hardship or other condition rendering compliance with such requirement impractical? In other words, what if this ends up being really terrible for ocean carriers or MTOs? Well, OSRA talks about that too. So this is assuming that the emergency order has gone into effect. And now the common carrier or the MTO is saying, I cannot file this. This is such hardship. This is rendering compliance impracticable. They could file a petition. So the FMC must decide within 21 days of the petition whether to allow the exception. And the rules of the emergency order don't apply while the petition is pending. That's interesting. That could almost be used as a strategy, right? So the emergency order goes into effect. It's only 60 days long. The common carrier, maybe the next day, files a petition saying, undue hardship, I can't do this. So the FMC must decide within 21 days of the petition whether to allow the exception. If they take all 21 days, which hopefully they wouldn't, but if they take all 21 days, the emergency order doesn't apply to the common carrier. So really, a 60-day emergency order might be reduced down to, 39 days? If they all file for the first 21 days, it's under consideration with the FMC. The emergency order rules aren't applying during the time. I don't know. We're not there yet. We're still just at step one, trying to find out, would an emergency order be helpful here? But if they do issue it, here's what I see as the second step. The now it's been issued, but we might have, hopefully the FMC will just be ready. If they do get these petitions, and they have to be filed, these petitions have to be filed in good faith. I mean, they can't just undue hardship. That's it. They have to file them with actual undue hardship that they can prove and that they can show. But I mean, it's a strategy to toll the time, right? I don't know. We'll see. Well, we're not there yet, like I said, but I'm really interested to hear from the industry here and read the comments as they come in. I've been reading the comments and I'm pretty interested in what it looks like and what people have been saying. Look, the FMC wants the industry to help them decide if they need to intervene. And what does that look like? I mean, what information relating to cargo throughput and availability do you need that would help you and really everybody around you in the industry ensure efficient movement, which is loading, unloading, transport of cargo to or from a vessel, a terminal, a wharf, or even an inland destination or point of origin? We've been seeing the FMC scooting further into inland ports or inland points and really kind of crossing over. They've been working with the STB, the Surface Transportation Board, which is arguably the rail side of things. They've been kind of moving over into that. We saw the recommendations coming out of the National Shipper Advisory Committee saying they should be further in on the rail side of things. But so let's talk about the comments. Before we get to that though, are you interested in filing comments? I think you should be. Because this is your moment. Look, this is your moment. We've been asking for a moment to talk to the FMC. We've been asking for a moment to let them know the strain, the pain points that shippers have been feeling, that motor carriers have been feeling, that everybody that could benefit from this has been feeling. This is your moment. So a few tips on filing comments. Introduce yourself. You'd be surprised. It's so important to be clear and concise, but introduce yourself. Don't forget to introduce yourself. Who are you? What is your company? What's your company's role in the industry, and why should the FMC take your comments into account? They don't know all companies that are out there, and sure, they could Google it, but that's another step. Just put it out there for them. One more sentence. We are a shipping company. We're shippers who tend to ship this type of cargo. Then they kind of have a mental image of like who you are and what your role is. So then, state your position in the industry. If you didn't in the introduction, identify your role in the industry. What is the nature of your business and its relationship to the rest of the supply chain? Remember, we're all a little siloed, so don't assume that the FMC understands your role or the nature of your business. Give a little overview explanation to make sure it's perfectly clear. If you're a shipper, explain what and how you ship and where your problem points are. And then start your comments. So that's just setting the stage. Let them know who you are. Bring them into your home and say, come on, sit down, pour a cup of tea. Let me tell you a little bit about me. And now, let me tell you some of my problems. So start your comments. You can include stories, examples, general perceptions, perspectives. Look, identify the problems that you're seeing in the industry with respect to this emergency order. Keep it focused on the emergency order. Make sure to keep the emergency order and these 3 questions close by and try to keep your comments targeted toward them, because while it might be interesting to hear all the other things that are happening, it's only going to distract from your main points. And this is the moment. We're going to have a lot of moments over the next 3 rulemakings that we're expecting to come out. But this moment is just for the emergency order and the information sharing, and it's a key piece. So let's lean in on this key piece. So make your suggestion then. You start your comments, you include your stories, you include, you answer the 3 questions. Would an emergency order help you? If so, what's the scope? And then now that you've identified the problems, if there's any other suggestions that you might suggest on the emergency order, that they're talking about information sharing. What specific information would you like shared? What would help you? A few things to note. As always, this is not legal advice. This should not be construed to be legal advice creating an attorney-client relationship. If you have specific questions, make sure to contact an attorney. This is just a suggested format for filing comments. There's no actual best method. The key is always clarity. Just be clear and simple in the presentation of your comments, because it's going to be read. And if depending on how many comments come in, there's going to be a lot of comments potentially. The more efficiently people can read your comments and understand them, the more likely your arguments will rise to the top. And don't forget, comments are public. These comments are public unless specifically requested to be filed confidentially, and there's instructions on how to do that, but there's certain ways of doing that. So just in general, what we're talking about here is public filed comments, but they are publicly filed, so other people will be able to read them, like me, and let you know what they're saying. So length of comments, there's no minimum or maximum length identified here. Look, if the comments are relevant, the FMC is going to read them, and they're going to be responding to them. So as I mentioned, there are 16 comments filed already. So most of those came right away. And we've talked about them before. If you want to look up the comments, the FMC maintains a list of all the documents related to this docket. It's docket 22-19. Go take a look. It's pretty interesting to watch them come in. But one notable commenter came right off the bat was the Association of Bi-State Motor Carriers. We talked about this a little bit before, and we've talked about the Bi-State Motor Carriers before when FMC Chairman Dan Maffei took a ride up to the port of New York, New Jersey after the Association of Bi-State Motor Carriers just wrote him a letter. They wrote him a letter raising concerns about equipment availability and demurrage and detention charges. This is when Chairman Maffei, this whole moment of this Bi-State Motor Carriers Association and Chairman Maffei, this is when Chairman Maffei said he wanted to ensure, this is a quote, to ensure that carriers do not receive involuntarily subsidized storage for empty containers that belong to them. He wanted to make sure carriers do not receive involuntarily subsidized storage for empty containers that belong. If it can, the quote continues, if it can be shown that a shipper or a trucker is not allowed to return a container, then not only should they not be charged per diem, but the carrier should compensate that trucker for the space it takes up. Did you hear that? If it can be shown that a shipper or trucker is not allowed to return a container, then not only should they not be charged per diem, but the carrier should compensate that trucker for the space it takes up. So basically he's saying not only does he not want you to pay for bogus detention, but he says you should probably get reimbursed for having to keep their empties while you can't return it, because that's ultimately a burden on you. It was a very key, interesting moment for Chairman Maffei. I thought it was a great quote. Well, look, so the Bi-State Motor Carriers weighed in and they said they strongly support the emergency order, stating that the lack of adequate information sharing has created an emergency situation that is adversely affecting motor carriers' operations. They cited lack of transparency regarding number of containers on last free day, potential gate demand, lack of transparency regarding appointment availability, lack of transparency on empty container return capacity, lack of visibility on MTO restrictions or other barriers to terminal entry, and lack of historical documentation of circumstances when freight movement was restricted or is restricted. And actually, most comments filed, especially the ones filed right off the bat, are strongly in favor of an issuance of an emergency order. We still have about a week left, and I'm curious to see how many comments we receive on this docket. But there was a really interesting comment filed just this week from Gnosis Freight. So Gnosis, spelled Gnosis, the G is silent. The definition of Gnosis, which I kind of had, I was interested. I looked it up because I was like, Gnosis. Knowledge of spiritual mysteries is what the word gnosis means. Well, it's kind of what they do, it seems. So it looks like this is a freight tech company. I wasn't familiar with them. It's as they say, a container life cycle management software, And they provide end-to-end supply chain visibility and automation solutions to logistics companies worldwide. So their request says that they don't think the emergency order would be possible to be fulfilled by the carriers and terminals. So they actually asked some questions. So do the common carriers and marine terminal operators have the data that such an emergency order would require them to provide? Gnosis says they think that they do, but they say in general they would probably have preferred for their customers to have had this data all along, right? So they're saying basically that maybe this data isn't being withheld, or maybe it's only being filtered down to their customers. But then they ask a second question. How would they go about providing this information in a format that would meet the standards for a commission-issued emergency order? They're saying that maybe the carriers and the MTOs might have trouble providing this information in a format that might meet standards for the commission-ordered emergency order. They note that it's often believed that carriers and MTOs are resistant to tech, but Gnosis says that they think the opposite's true. They explain that because there was no standards for providing shipping data at the time when all tech infrastructure was built, each one was designed to provide slightly different data and different formats based on the carrier or terminal company preferences. This, they say, is what has made it incredibly burdensome for shippers to organize and interpret the data they currently receive. So their solution, Gnosis Freight, says that a technology vendor should be included in the emergency order for it to have any impact on the current supply chain disruption. Gnosis says that a technology vendor should be included in the emergency order for them to have any impact on the current supply chain disruption through this emergency order. I find that really interesting. I mean, it's a good point. It's making it probably larger and more burdensome than the emergency order that they initially wanted to release. On the one hand, they do make a good point. On the other, though, is it a sales pitch? Then they go on to say, Gnosis Freight is already taking data from all of these sources, common carriers, ports, terminals, rail operators, normalizing it and then presenting it in a standard format that's easier for their customers, shippers, drayage companies, etc., to interpret and act on. It's an interesting comment, isn't it? I think you should go check it out. This is what I mean. This is what I mean when I say I give advice on how to submit comments. Make it easy to understand. Identify the problems that you see clearly, simply, and then simply explain how it could be solved. And if you have that solution, cleanly and simply state it. It's a really interesting from Gnosis comment. I really encourage you to go check it out because they're kind of talking about what this looks like in practical sense. Maybe it wasn't a sales pitch. Maybe it's just maybe they're just available to do this. I don't know. I think it's interesting. There was one more comment filed by BBT Logistics. They state specific ways that they want information disseminated. This is super helpful. They say that they believe the scope of this emergency order should include, but not necessarily be limited to, marine terminals that require appointments for movement of freight. These are all suggestions that they have for what type of information. So marine terminals that require appointments for movement of freight must clearly indicate the number of appointments available for each type of move, so specific to time slot, steamship line, and container size, and must notify shippers, motor carriers, and ocean carriers when those appointment slots are fully booked or no longer available. They also suggest information sharing could include when a location is designated as an empty container return location, notice must be given on the total number of containers being accepted, specific to the steamship line, the carrier, and container size. If capacity is reached before the end of the day and empties are shut out by the terminal, notice must be sent out to the shippers, ocean carriers, and motor carriers, documenting the lack of available return location. They also suggest if a marine terminal operator places restrictions on the free flow of empty container returns, for example, requiring double moves only, restricting returns for a specific steamship line or carrier to certain time windows, etc., shippers, ocean carriers, and motor carriers must be notified of these restrictions as they may adversely affect the motor carrier's ability to return the container. When on-street congestion and or extreme traffic conditions warrant temporary closures of access to the terminal, notification must be sent to shippers, carriers, and motor carriers, including timestamps of when the metering commenced and when free flow into the terminal resumed. Port law enforcement agencies and port operations personnel may assist in this notification process as warranted. A couple more suggestions here. When systems issues adversely affect a terminal abilities to process trucks, notification must be sent to shippers, ocean carriers, and motor carriers, including timestamps indicating when the system issue commenced and when the issue was resolved. Those are very specific instances of when they think information sharing can be helpful and what the information that they would like. That is so effective. If there's specific information, if you agree with those, go borrow them. Say that, we agree with the comments filed by BBT Logistics. So they continue and provide examples of how the lack of information sharing has actually adversely affected their ability to move freight efficiently. Great. They're basically saying, here's why we think this is an emergency situation. Returning empty containers to their origin point only to find out the amount of empties received was met and no more empties could be returned. Or unable to utilize a Saturday gate because of a double move being required. Or within minutes the booking times are filled and unable to secure any times. Or even if they can get an appointment, the appointment times do nothing to alleviate the traffic. They still have lines of trucks lined up outside the ports only to be turned away due to congestion. A great example of very specific, these are very interesting comments. There's a couple, they're all interesting, right? All 16, but I encourage you to keep track of these. You want to hear what other people are saying? This is the moment. If you want to say something, this is your moment. Maybe it was unfair of me to say that Gnosis was doing a little sales pitch. Maybe they were. Maybe that's another effective use of the comments there. Now I know who Gnosis is, and I'm going to be watching them. They raised some really good points, though. What does this look like in practicality? Is the information going to be helpful? But I think that the comments from BBT Logistics are very on point in saying exactly what information that they would want required. So that's it. We have just under a week to file these comments. FMC tends to accept late filed comments, so if you find yourself up against the deadline and don't make it, still submit them. But it's in their discretion. It's in FMC's discretion to accept. And they tend to accept them, but who knows? It's in their discretion. Something to take into consideration. Just try to hit that deadline. So September 14th. We've been asking to have a voice. These rulemakings and requests for information comments are that chance. Don't miss this chance here. Get your thoughts together and send them over. As always, the guidance here is general for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice directly related to your matter. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. But if you have specific legal questions, feel free to reach out to me at my legal company, Squall Strategies. Otherwise, for the non-legal, e-learning, and general industry information and insights, come find me at the Maritime Professor. If you like these videos, let me know. Comment, like, and share. If you missed any previous videos, these videos live on my YouTube page, By Land and by Sea, presented by the Maritime Professor. Or you can go find them on demand on our podcast, By Land and by Sea. And while you're at it, check out our website, themaritimeprofessor.com. So until next week, this is Lauren Beagen, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and by Sea. See you next time.